Okay, so we're gonna do an intro video to the Genekeys profile and the setup of the Genekeys book. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you see the slideshow?
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, as the Genekeys is a contemplative sort of self-study, then of course you can use it as like an oracle, or you can get readings and ask other people to read your profile, but ultimately it would be a contemplation tool for yourself to use to understand your own constitution better. So my way of seeing it obviously is based on what I've learned and realized through my own study and talking to other people. But it's a living, breathing text, and there's different scopes of people's knowledge of it. So what I share is just how I see it, and may it be help to you as you study and contemplate your own self through the Genekeys. So let's see, why is it not moving? I like to start by bringing up the Eching, because I first had a friend who studied the Genekeys, and he would read to me from the Genekeys, and I thought it was interesting. I got a book of my own, but it was at that time just it was a little too much for me. So I ended up coming across a copy of the Eching in a used bookstore out in Massachusetts, and I picked up the book. And can you see me still?
Yeah.
I picked up the book. I found this book. It says The Book of Changes and the Unchanging Truth. And I started looking through it, and I was interested. So I brought it home with me. So the reason why I like to start there is because it gives us a foundation for understanding the format of the Genekeys and the lines and sort of the history of where it came from. So the Eching, and I may not be saying that correctly, but that's how I say it, is an ancient Chinese oracle text that was channeled and has been translated tons of times throughout history, from language to language, and person to person. And the way I understand it is the Eching was sort of like the way that they communicated at that time was perhaps more sort of poetic and metaphorical. So the Eching has a lot of like story imagery, talking about the tail of the tiger and giving you less like direct to our day information, and sort of more painting a picture for you to draw conclusions from or insights from. So the way both the Eching and the Genekeys work is they're 64 hexagrams, and the way that they got these hexagrams is they are the okay, so it starts at the building blocks of our universe or our reality, which is a polarity planet. So there are inverses that can constitute everything that is this life. So you could think of it as like ones and zeros, yin and yang, on and off. If you start to talk about like feminine and masculine, we have a lot of associations with that. So you can think of just ones and zeros, or yin and yang, if you know anything about that. So if you can imagine, the universe started with just these two poles, right? And everything that is in our reality is a combination or an interchange of these two poles. So you have the yin and the yang, and then when you combine, let's see, so you have the yin and the yang, and then the I Ching talks about, so I'm trying to figure out how to put this. So you have the yin and the yang, and it breaks it down into these 3 pairs. So the 3 pair, or a 3 combination of the yin and the yang, as you can see here, they have associated the elements with a set of these 3 yin and yangs. So you can have, there's 8 combinations of these 3 pairs, as you can see here. So they say, and the Eching says, the combination of 3 yin lines, which are these broken lines here, is indicative of earth. A yin, yin, yang, which it's from the bottom up always, you read it from the bottom up. So a yin, yin, yang, they have associated with mountain. So there are these different combinations of these 2 poles. And as you can imagine, if everything was just the default of on, off, on, off, on, off, we wouldn't have this whole colored, fanciful universe of stories and characters. So once you combine a triad of these combinations of yin and yang, you start to create diversity and story. So the combinations of these 3 sets of yin and yang is what starts to build the elements. So we have water is yin, yang, yin, and so on and so forth. So sure, that is, we're starting to create complexity, but that's pretty cut and dry. These triads, it's like you can imagine a triangle is pretty sturdy and stable, and we live in a world where there's a story arc. You know, our minds make sense of things through stories, and so the I Ching puts together 2 sets of these elements, one on top of another, and then you get basically like a story, and that's the 64 hexagrams, which there's also 64 gene keys, but the 64 is all the combinations of 6 lines of both yin and yang that you can possibly have. And each combination of these 6 lines is basically just like an element of human existence. So you can see here, some of the examples are 36 gene or hexagram is following. There's cauldron, there's opposition, there's family, and every different copy of the I Ching that you might pick up will have a different, they don't always have the same name, because these are concepts that aren't necessarily cut and dry. So if you picked up a different I Ching, number 20 cauldron might be like, I can't remember any of the other ones per se right now, but like, you know, pot of food, or like magical alchemy. Like they're different ways of saying the same sort of thing. So if you pick up a different I Ching copy, these will be a little bit different, but they should be inferring the same sort of concept. So you have these various combinations of the yin yang energy made into these 6-line hexagrams, and it becomes metaphorical sort of at that point. So say you have, because these are right on top of each other, you have thunder under earth, and you have you could have a hexagram here. So then the concept of that hexagram is going to be sort of the story arc of what it might be like when the element of thunder is under the element of earth, and what that might mean for a way of being in the world, and or the interaction between these 2 elements creates a story. And why that is, why I want to bring that up is because that sort of starts to help you understand the lines of any given hexagram or any given gene keys. And the gene keys doesn't talk as much about how the lines came to be, or sort of what their format is per se in the same way. So in that sense, you can say you rolled your oracle in the Eching and you got 13, which here is conflict. You have this story arc basically. And as you can imagine, so say you have a story, and we'll oversimplify it, a story about, you know, you going to the store one day. So the basic format of a story you could imagine is sort of like the first sentence of the story will be like, Holly woke up from her sleep and she was having dreams and she woke up and she knew she was going to go to the store that day. And the second sentence of that story might be sort of like informational, sort of like, Holly was, you know, she lives in a house and she has a cat and she likes to drink milk, so that's why she needed to go to the store that day. So the first line is sort of an introduction that tells, sort of speaks of the whole story to come. The second line might be sort of details about that story. The third line might be when the action starts to come, like, okay, so now she leaves the house to go to the store. She gets in her car. So it has information about what's happening. Then line 4 might be sort of the like, she runs into a squirrel or narrowly avoids a squirrel. So that's sort of like the action. Line 5 might be the climax, like she has to, you know, call her friend that knows about healing squirrels and have them come down. And then the 6th line or the 6th sentence might be like, the squirrel is fine, she went on to the store, she got her milk. And the 6th line sort of contains the whole story within it, but it also speaks to like what might happen in the future. Like we don't know what happens at the store, so it's sort of like, here's leading up to that. So you can sort of think of that for any hexagram or gene key. It's sort of a story arc. And through the story arc, we derive meaning for what this concept is trying to convey, grace. So if you have a certain line, then that's telling you that your gene key number holds the energy, the tone of what that line might stand for. And in general, the lines have sort of common themes, meaning a line 1 may be a very like sort of stable, you know, it's the first line of the story, there's not a lot of climax, there's not a lot of, it's giving you the baseline. So you can sort of look at it that way. A lot of the line 1s will be giving you a baseline. The line 2 will be giving you more information, will be sort of like, it's not the initiatory force, it's the explanation, it's the filling in the gaps. So all the lines have a different sort of energy to them. And every line for each gene key has a different part of the story. So if you have a line 4 in any given thing, you will want to read that line to give you sort of a broader or a more specific scope for that part of that particular gene key. And it's always obviously interesting to hear the whole story first, so you can sort of get a sense of the story arc, and then you can zoom in on the line to see like what is the hue of that particular color you could see it as. So say you have cauldron, and cauldron could be equated with the color blue. So if you have a line 4, your blue hue could be, I don't know, teal or something, if you consider that still blue. So it's just you know, different scopes of that concept that allow you to understand sort of your place within it, or the concept as a whole, because you know, we live in a polarity planet, but words and any other thing that we use to describe these concepts are inevitably limited, and we acknowledge that limitation and commit to still using language to understand things that are beyond language by allowing there to be sort of space in between. And I like the I Ching's metaphoricalness in that way, because you're conscious of the fact that it's interacting with your mind and your system. And so the way that you hear it or when you hear it is going to change how you feel about it. So nothing is like cut and dry. Nothing, even though some person might have cauldron in the same spot, maybe they have a different line, or maybe they have the same gene key and the same line, but they have all these other parts that are different. So it changes how it shows up and where you live and the language you speak, all the different factors change how it occurs to you. So in that way, it's even more evident how it's a self-contemplation, because it's a living, breathing tool for communicating and understanding yourself in a world that is so dynamic and complex and has all of these elements within it and combinations of them. And so to look at it, or to ever say that you really truly knew or that you finally got it, wouldn't be a human life, basically, but you can still look at it through different scopes and understandings. So that's the format of the Eching, and that helps us to understand the lines that are part of the gene keys and just basically like what it's talking about. It's talking about, so the gene keys is a modern day translation or reiteration, rechanneling of the Eching in a different type of language that's perhaps more attuned to our current day's understanding of science and genes and the language we use now, which is perhaps more literal and less metaphorical. So it has the same 64, there's 64 gene keys, and it has the lines, but the Eching didn't have a profile, so you couldn't put in your birth info. It was more of just an oracle, which you can use the gene keys as an oracle. You just open it up. And because these things are universal to our existence, you can read any part of it and find value in it in your own life. Or you can, even if you don't have a certain gene key in your profile, doesn't mean that it doesn't appeal to you or isn't a part of you. They all are ultimately. They're all just like energetic exchange and ways of looking at a thing. So you can use the gene keys as an oracle if you want, which is how the Eching was originally used. But then now the gene keys has the profile, which is derived from your birth time and place, and it gives you a format for looking at yourself, your different elements that you're working with in different places, a lot like astrology, just in a different way. So the Genekeys website obviously is super helpful in so many ways. It's so thorough and so deep and dynamic. This is not interactive, but if you were to go to this on the Genekeys website, they have information for any given gene key that you can click on, and you can go scroll down and there's all this additional information. It'll go deeper into the victim consciousness. It'll go deeper into the amino acid codon rings. And so I bring that up to say that the website is just so helpful and such a companion and goes so deep once you start to want to understand all the different dynamics of this elaborate system, which is so fun and so interesting. And it brings back in the astrological aspects and the pathways and so on and so forth. So this is just a copy that I made of it, but it will go deeper into the depths of each gene key, but not necessarily like the book is going to be the thing that will tell you, that will flesh out each gene key, but this site gives you all these other sort of connective points. So this is the profile, and you can get your profile on the Genekeys website for free. It's really easy. The site, again, if you get to your profile on the site, there's all these different things you can toggle. So in order to make it easier to see and understand, you can, you can go on there and you can show and hide different aspects to make it easier to see. So you can show just the pathways, which would be here, or you can show just the gift, and it makes it really easy to simplify as you're looking at your own profile. But this is the profile. That everybody's going to have if they put in their birth info. The only thing that will be different for each person is these numbers, and every sphere here will have a number in it on your profile. This is just a generic copy. So every one of these spheres is going to have this number in it, a number with a point and another number. And the first number, as it's seen here, is number 5, is your gene key for that particular sphere. And the point, whatever, is the line. So this person in this sphere has a gene key of number 5. Out of the 64 gene keys, they got number 5 here. And they have a line 6 for that number 5 gene key. So we already talked about what the lines mean. And then they aren't all shown here, but each line in between these spheres is a pathway. And that is sort of the interplay between any given sphere, especially when you're talking about sequences. So sort of their action in the world between each other, how they relate with each other, the lesson, the pathway that you're on when you're traveling through the profile between spheres. So there is a pathway through the whole profile, sort of default pathway, and there's right now there's 3 different sequences that you can hone in on. So you see the colors here. This bubble has green, and it's half green, half blue, actually. This one's green, this one's green, this one's half green, half red. So all the different colors show you the different sequences, and those are sort of like further story arcs. So every gene key is a story arc, and because we live in such like a world of complexity, we create stories within stories. So each sequence is sort of a story in and of itself, and the sequences are connected. So there's an order that is the default order, starting from the top here. And this doesn't have arrows, but if you looked at your profile online, these have arrows. So there's a default path that you lead when you're going on this self-contemplation. And it leads you through the 3 sequences that are connected to each other and brings you sort of to an endpoint, which is also a beginning, which in the Eching is shown by the fact that the 64th hexagram it's before crossing the water. The 63rd is after crossing the water. The 64th is before crossing the water. So it's sort of like octaves in a way. Like the seventh note is sort of like a lead in to back to the beginning. And so it's like that with all of these things. Everything is cyclical, and there isn't really an end, even though sometimes we conceive of an end. So once you get to the end of this structure, you can begin again, and we do throughout life. So that's the basic format of the profile. And then for each gene key, when you get the book, or you'll see when you get your profile, for each gene key, you're going to have 3 words stacked, and then the line. So the top word for any gene key, and if you had your whole profile, every bubble would have a number, like I said, and then it will have the stack of the 3 lines. So the top line is the city, the middle line is the gift, and the bottom line is the shadow. And so like I was talking about the I Ching, and there was the cauldron. So The Genekeys is a little different in that instead of just saying cauldron, every hexagram has 3 words to describe that principle. And that's shown through the shadow, the gift, and the city. So in a way, you could look at it sort of like the shadow and the gift might be the more the poles of the concept, the flip side of the coin, but they're both on the same coin. And then the city you could look at as the sort of overarching title of that coin in a way. So there's a shadow and a gift to all of us and all of our dynamics. And then there's the city, which is always a word that, like, the city is the plane where polarity doesn't explain everything. And so the city is trying to use words to describe something that absolutely can't be known through words, although it tries. And so it's holding the sort of overarching understanding beyond the duality of any given dynamic. So I found this online, and I thought this was interesting. You could look at the shadow as the channel of possession. So the shadow way of looking at something is usually pinpoint zoom in. It's sort of the like it contains the details of something, but it's not looking at the whole picture. It's very specific and pointed. And so the channel of possession is sort of that frequency of like, I've got this. Like the shadow might think it knows, and it might be buying into the duality or the pole as indicative of the whole. And so you're possessing these understandings in order to sort of do all these human shadow things we do, like hold on and cling and own and that type of aspect. So it's also worth to say that just like the light and dark, you can't have one without another. So although we may, through this inquiry, want to attempt to avoid the shadow because it may seemingly cause us problems, it's also just a scope of understanding. And both the shadow and the gift and the city all exist at the same time. They're just perhaps like different ways of looking at the thing, or you're at a different plane of awareness, or just a different scope. So you can't have one without another. And in fact, the shadow informs the gift and the city, and the interplay is sort of like the yin yang. Like we may see shadow as being bad, but it is not necessarily bad, and it's inevitable. So the gift here in this format is potential. So the channel of passion. So if you have the channel of possession, which keeps you gripping, the channel of passion is sort of like when you're using what you have and you're aware of the shadow maybe, and you're using what you have to engage in the system rather than try to cling to it. So you're using the shadow and the gift as a way to move throughout the world and be impassioned by what you're doing. The city, which here says the essence, it could be seen as the channel of grace. So we have possession, we have passion, and then we have grace, which already you're like, okay, grace is a little bit more of an amorphous sort of word. It's kind of like, what exactly is grace? And it is perhaps the understanding of the whole interworking and the not necessarily buying into one or the other, but being able to play in that sphere of awareness where you see them all and you move beyond it while being in it. So a lot of this stuff is paradoxical, and that's what's beautiful about it, in my opinion. But if we try to hold too tightly to the definitions and the understandings, I think we do ourselves a bit of a disservice, because that's just, it's not the case. That this is a living, breathing life, and it can never fully be understood because we're just one part, but there is understanding to be had within it. So The last thing I'll say here is of the 3 sequences, the green is going to be and there's companion books. There's 3 companion books for the sequences. And then there's another one, which I don't have here. But the green is the genius sequence. So that's where you start. You start up here at the life's work. And these don't have the titles of what each sphere is, but we'll get to that. So the green is the genius sequence. It's sort of, it would be the sort of most like foundational aspect of your profile. It's sort of like what you're working with, your foundation, the structure that makes you. So it's a good place to start to find out sort of your like main components. Then it moves from the genius sequence to the Venous sequence, or love and relationships. So once you figure out about yourself and what you're working with, you move from sort of from in to out. You start to see yourself reflected through your relationships, and whether that's like with people that are your children, your husband or whatever, or just the people that you interact with in the world, because we can't, like in most cases, can't not have interactions with other people. So you go from your basic foundation into the Venous sequence, which is all about relationships and your place within the world and how you engaged with your family and different times of your life and your romantic relationships, and then therefore your sort of like vocation in the world. And then after you go through the Venous sequence, up through the Venous sequence, backwards in time, and we'll talk about that in a bit, you enter the Pearl sequence. And the Pearl is about, it's also known as the prosperity sequence. So once you go from your foundation to relationships and how you see yourself through your relationships, you enter the Pearl sequence, which is more about what's important to you, what your work in the world is, how you sort of bring what your foundation is and your engagement with other people into prosperity or receiving or creation, and what's important to you in those spheres. So those are the 3 sequences, and I've heard that there's going to be one more sequence that's being developed. I don't know what it is, but we'll look out for that. So yeah, I think we can move on. So these is just another depiction, like I was saying, of the different sequences. So we have the activation sequence, which also I call the genius sequence. And again, you could see that sort of as like, if it's your foundational principles, then that sort of starts with the physical, like what you're working with. Then you move to the Venous sequence, which is about opening your heart and has to do with emotions, as the emotions have everything to do with how we engage with the world around us and the people, essentially. And then you move to the Pearl sequence, liberating your prosperity, and like is mirrored in a lot of places in the profile, becomes the mental sphere. So if you're a developing human, you could see it as you start with the physical, you add the emotions to become an emotional, talking, communicating, engaging being. And then you develop the mental awareness of your scope within the world and your understanding of how things work and other worlds and things like that. So those are the 3 sequences. So here we have the names of each sphere. So there's 11 different spheres in a profile. And some of them are, if they are on the end of a sequence connecting to, like this one has green and red, they kind of have a double understanding. So you could in a way sort of look at them as separate, but that would be, trying to act like there's an end to things and a beginning when really everything is a continuation. So This picture has the names of each sphere, and then it has the pathways in between. It doesn't have the arrows. That would have been nice. But yeah, so what you'll see here, I've named both the names for both understandings when you're looking at this sphere through the scope of your Venous sequence. It is titled core. When you're looking at the sphere in the scope of the Pearl sequence or the entire profile, it's called vocation, and the line remains the same, but the understanding of what the line is talking about is different, and that is shown in the different books. So if you go into the Venous sequence book, you'll learn about the core wound. If you go into the Pearl sequence book, you'll learn about it through the scope of vocation. And then these are all the pathways in between. So I think I have, yeah, we start with the genius, the activation sequence. So we're going to break down each sphere, starting from the top, and this one finally has the arrows. So this is sort of the pathway you take on your contemplation throughout the whole profile. You start at the top with life's work. So again, mirrored throughout this whole system of understanding, we have these pairs in all these various places. So you could sort of see this as the life's work is the, the inverse or the yin yang with purpose. So life's work you could see as what you do in the world. And purpose, you could see it as how you be in the world. So life's work is going to be, again, starting with like a physical manifestation. It's going to be what you do, the things you're interested in, the way you do them, your action, your outward sort of action in the world. And then again, there's all these different inverses in different directions. So the life's work and the purpose are sort of inverses, but then we have a pair between the life's work and the evolution. And those are, so if somebody has a certain gene key as their life's work, then they're going to always have this complementary gene key as their evolution, as these become a pair, like as you can imagine. So you have life's work, which is what you do in the world. Then if that were just cut and dry, it'd be like you'd always do that and that would look the same every time, theoretically. But the evolution is the companion to life's work because it's the stuff that comes in to, develop your skills. Like what you do is fine as it is, but you need the evolution to keep the motor running, sort of. So these two are a pair in and of themselves. So if I met somebody else who had, I think these are mine. So if I met somebody else who had this gene key as their life's work, they would also have this gene key as their evolution. However, we could have different lines. So that's something to note. So life's work is what you do in the world. Your evolution, like I started to say, is your growth point, the place where you will often have challenges throughout your life through the theme of that. It'll be the place where you learn the most and can also grow the most. So this is through the pathway of challenge, as you can imagine, from life's work to evolution. Then we move from evolution to radiance, and that is the pathway of breakthrough. So radiance could be seen as, you could intuit, radiance is sort of like your radiance, what is natural to you that you just radiate, and often people come to you for that, or they see that in you, or you could often like sort of be attracted to that sort of concept in other people or out in the world. So your radiance is what you radiate, and often has to do with your health, because if you're radiant, if you're radiating what's important to you or what's true to you, then It has to do with your ease, your health, how things come about, I guess, in the world. So this is the path of breakthrough, moving from evolution, which is about challenge and grit, to a place of radiance where you're able to own what is true for you and radiate it out. And so you could see how these two, the purpose and the radiance, sort of become another pair that are interworking with each other. So if purpose is how you be, which is more, it's less direct than life's work, because that's what you do. So how you be is sort of just like how you do what you do and the way that you do it and your tendencies and how you hold yourself while you're doing it. So you could see how radiance and purpose go hand in hand, in that they're different ways of how you be in the world and what you put off sort of indirectly. So the pathway between these two is core stability. You could imagine going from realizing your radiance in the world to honing in how you be is who you are. It's your core stability, and it all comes from this pathway of understanding what you do and then meeting challenges and then coming more into your radiance through breakthrough and then solidifying that with how you be in the world as your core stability. So I've included here all the lines for each of these, and I maybe won't read them for everyone because you can find them, but it is interesting to, for any given sphere, read all the lines. Like I was saying before, like it's interesting to sort of get a sense of what the whole scope of the story is for radiance, for instance. So there's always going to be 6 lines available for any sphere. So anybody who has any of the 64 gene keys for radiance will be combined with one of the 6 lines that sort of further color that concept of what their radiance is. So, and I'm kind of a wordy person as it is, so for me it's pretty fluid and easy to read a word and then to just sort of sit back and contemplate what that word could possibly mean and all the different like definitions and understandings of what that word means, even if I don't if I'm not super familiar with that word. So for me, it's easy enough to read these words and then just sort of contemplate how they play with each other or their meanings, which you can do even if you don't go deep into your Genekeys profile or the book. You could look at your profile, you could read the gift, shadow, and city, and just sort of like intuit or feel out how those concepts come together to create an understanding of a certain theme in life. So you can do that with the storylines as well, and that's why I like to just read them as the whole story. And if you have the books, like it'll go deeper. It talks more about line 1 solitude, line 2 marriage. It'll go deeper into it. So that's up to you, but I've included the lines here for us to just sort of like sit with. So for the sphere of radiance, being how I described what radiance means, there is line 1, and if it mattered, if we had the hexagrams with us, line 1 would be on the bottom. It doesn't really matter for the gene keys, but it's interesting to note. Line 1 for the radiant sphere is solitude. Line 2 is marriage. Line 3, interaction. Line 4, friendship. Line 5, impact. And line 6, nurture. So I'm not really going to go too much into interpreting what those mean to me, which could be fun, but it's more just for you to see that. So for the radiant sphere, which we talked about what the radiant sphere is a symbol of, you can have all of these different lines or ways of being radiant through solitude, through marriage, through interaction, through friendship, through impact, through nurture. So for any given sphere, you can go through and read the different lines, and you can start to see what deeper into what like purpose is trying to indicate. And these in a way are a bit metaphorical in how, well, unless you read the book, you can get more details, but they're a bit metaphorical in how they're helping you to understand the concept of purpose and your individual purpose through your gene key, through the different scope of the lines. And again, each line has a different sort of like energy that it holds in relationship to the whole. So that might be a bit complex, but we're just going to move on from there to the Venous sequence. So after we came down to the purpose.
Wait a second. Can I ask you one thing?
Yeah, please.
Go back to where you were, the other sequence. You said that if you have 50, like you do for your life's work, the gene key number 50, that you're always going to have 3 gene key for your evolution?
Yes.
And is it the same with radiance and purpose?
Oh,
If you
yeah,
have-
it is. It is. Good question. And this may be present in other places in the profile. I don't actually know that, but I know that it is the case for this, and it's interesting how it ties in with you know, like math and numerology, and that like we start with the duality, inevitably duality will double unless it's in the elemental 3 triad, but the duality doubles, and then we get, you know, the directions, the 4 corners, the sort of like foundational aspect of being. But nothing in our world is just square. There's other combinations. So this is an interesting sort of like foundational mirror system, in that the life's work and the purpose are sort of mirroring each other, but the life's work and the evolution are really like, if you were to look at the hexagrams, those 6 combinations of lines, the hexagram for your life's work is the exact inverse of the evolution. So if you had all yin, just for instance, as the hexagram for your life's work, then your evolution is going to be the hexagram where all the lines are yang lines. So that's interesting too, because you have your life's work and what comes in to push your life's work along, but the exact inverse of that set of lines. Yeah. So the radiance and the purpose are inverse as well, and they go hand in hand. So anyone who has 56 as their radiance will have 60 as their purpose. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I didn't know that.
Yeah. I didn't realize that until much later too, and I find that very interesting.
And you just happen to have the same line number and those radiance and purpose line 4, and then life works and evolution line 2.
That's a good question. The line number for both of those, I just remembered, is always going to be the same.
Oh, it is.
Doesn't mean that everybody who has 56 as radiance will have line 4, but if you have line 4 here, you will have line 4 in your purpose.
Oh.
Okay, can we move on?
Yeah.
Okay, so then, like I was saying, if there's a certain sphere that doubles, so the purpose sphere is part of the activation sequence as well as the Venous sequence, the title of the line, you're still going to have line 4 as your sphere, if that's what you have, but the title of it, when you're looking at it from the scope of the Venous sequence, will be different. So that becomes evident if you're using the site and you're toggling for it to show you only your Venous sequence. It will switch it so that you're only looking at the line 4's title from the Venous sequence perspective. Or if you're looking in the book, like see, this is the Venous Sequence book. So if I look in here, it's going to say line 4 is the nurturer politician. But as you see here, line 4, when you're looking at the activation sequence, is breath and rhythm. So that would be what you would see if you look in this book. So it's the same line. And again, it's just different ways, different scopes, different vantage points of looking at the same energy. So once we get to the Venous sequence, the purpose also double. Well, now we're looking at it in the scope of relationships or emotions. So it goes from being about your foundational system, so mine was breath, to now being about how I be in more terms of relationships. So it's the nurturer politician. So the purpose is sort of similar in this place when you're looking at the Venous sequence, but it's in relationship to relationships. So then we move down the pathway of Dharma to the attraction sphere, and the whole Venous sequence is where we get into different times of your life. So these 3 different spheres symbolize different periods of your life, 7-year cycles. But we're going backwards in time through them. So we move from purpose to attraction, and attraction sphere is about, partnerships. Like it is attraction in general, who you're attracted to and who's attracted to you, but it specifically has to do with romantic relationships, partnerships. It can be versatile in that way. So your attraction sphere is about romantic relationships or partnerships. And because that oftentimes is sort of more formulated after, when we're a bit like older, like after school age, that's why, see, we're going back in time. So we go straight into the most recent sort of developmental phase. And then we follow the pathway of karma, which, you'll have to look deeper into what the pathways mean for the relationships between these spheres. But we move to the IQ. So as you can see here, these 3 spheres all have this SQ, EQ, IQ. So the Q stands for intelligence. The I in this case is intellectual. So the IQ is intellectual intelligence. So this is the part of you that was developed from age roughly 14 to 21. Then going back in time, we have the EQ, which is emotional intelligence. That was developed from ages 7-ish to 14. And then the SQ is your development from age 0 to 7, and the S stands for spiritual. So it's your spiritual intelligence. So we're going backwards in time through these 3 7-year cycles. And you can sort of look at their relationship to each other as like what you developed from ages 0 to 7 again is like, it's back to the physical, but in a way it's also spiritual, because it's sort of subconsciously developed, because it was that period of time from 0 to 7 when you were not necessarily separate from your surroundings or your people. It's what was built into you before you had a concept of what any of this was or who you were within it. You were just a part of the whole, basically. And, more or less as you got a little bit older, but your spiritual intelligence is what is just baked deep into you about how your place in the world, your safety, your security, your just embodied presence is what you developed from age 0 to 7. So that's your spiritual intelligence. So then from ages 7 to 14, you have your emotional intelligence. So once you age out of that period of time when you're just part of the bubble and you're not distinguished, more or less, you move into your emotional intelligence. So from 7 to 14, you're all of a sudden becoming more aware of how you fit into the scope of your network. You're becoming more aware of your emotions and how you relate with different people and what your place is within that network. And so that is your emotions. You become more aware of your emotions, how to use them or how they use you, or so on and so forth. So this is the age range from 7 to 14. And then after that is the age range from 14 to 21, which is your intellectual intelligence. Again, it's the emotional, the mental. So we went from physical, what's ingrained into you, to the emotional, and then again to the mental. So this is when you start to develop understandings of the world at large, or philosophy, ideas, what you want to do in the world, how you think about things. That's all developed from ages 14 to 21. And that's called the intellectual intelligence. So again, in the Venous sequence scope, we are moving backwards in time through the attraction sphere, through the pathway of karma to your intellectual intelligence. So you'll see the line here, and the line here, the practical mind. So all the lines of the intellectual intelligence are talking about your mind, your mental scope. Then we move backwards in time through to the emotional intelligence. And so you can see this has to do with emotions. The line of your EQ has to do with emotions and interactions with others, how you relate. And anytime that you see a sort of like slash here for any of the lines, that sort of means, again, it's sort of like the shadow in the gift, more so like balanced and imbalanced, like when you're out of balance, or when you're out of balance, you might veer more in the meanness direction, and when you're balanced, your emotional intelligence might come in the form of kindness. So then moving backwards in time through the pathway of love to your SQ, which is your spiritual intelligence, developed from ages 0 to 7, and often has to do with these two here are sort of like your baseline, and a lot of times your core wound. So the line of the SQ often is something that you didn't receive as a young child, sometimes, or you really needed in order to develop properly. And a lot of times we didn't always get it the way that we wanted. And so that's why it creates an initial wound. So we're moving backwards in time. And then these three phases of 7 years will repeat throughout your life. So after you age out of the 14 to 21, you go back to your SQ phase and you revisit the aspects of your spiritual intelligence. So you can correlate that to different time periods in your life now to see which 7-year cycle you're reliving, and revisiting it. It may sometimes mean that we're replaying certain things of the cycle, but it also gives us an opportunity to look at parts of ourselves again, or to revamp them, or to see them and to learn how to work with them better. So these three repeat throughout your life. And then going even further backwards in time, you get to the core, or the core wound. So this sphere is a symbol of your gestation phase. So when you were in the womb from 0 to 9 months. So even though this is a phase in time, these ones are said to repeat, but the core wound is just always part of you, so it doesn't really repeat. But this is what you may have been experiencing when you were in your mom's belly. So this is called core. It has to do with your core wound. And the way that I look at it is because we all have a core wound, which is essentially the separation from your mother. We all had to be separated from our mother. And whether that was like actually traumatic or wounding to you, or not in a more literal way, you could look at it as just like the first separation, the first wound that you got was having to be separated from just full oneness, full care, full support of just being ingrained in your mom's body. And so a lot of what happened during that time, maybe from your mom or the environment that you were in, will create the type of separation wound that that's symbolic of that period of time in your life. And so all the lines of the core sphere have to do with separation, like original separation. So mine here is isolation and care. So the only other thing about this I wanted to say is that the reason that we're going back in time is because we're sort of like undoing what has been done. So if you were to address yourself, or you wanted to make shifts or changes, the things that were developed last, and of course the intellect is more having to do with words and ideas. So it's easier to address the intellectual part of you from a head-on sort of conscious place, and with using ideas to address ideas, basically. And as we go back in time, things become more ingrained in who we are, and a little bit more subconscious, a little bit more written in. And so if you were to address these spheres, if you wanted to become more aware or make adjustments, they're going to become harder to address from a logical mental standpoint. They have to do with the emotions and body. So we're going backwards in time as sort of like an undoing from what was developed, to address first what was most recently developed, and what can be thought of through ideas and concepts, going backwards in time to our core wounds, which a lot of times play out in our life, you know, subconsciously or without us really trying or wanting it to be that way. And so these often need to be tended to with a lot more you know, delicacy and subtlety and time and space, in that they're very deeply ingrained in who you are, and they don't necessarily respond to words and intentions in the same direct way. So, unless there's questions, we will move on to the next sequence.
Can you just give me the age numbers again from the first one? IQ is 7 to 14 and EQ is
Let's go from start to finish. So the core is
okay.
in the belly, in the womb, 0 to 9 months. The SQ is 0 to 7. And you know, I just, these are like rough because I say 0 to 7, and then I say 7 to 14. So the SQ is 0 to 7, spiritual intelligence. Then 7 to 14 is your emotional intelligence, EQ. And then 14 to 21 is IQ, intellectual intelligence. So then that goes to say that ages 21 to 28, you will be revisiting the concepts of your SQ. So then the last sequence is the Pearl sequence. So this is the one sequence where all of the arrows are double-sided. And the way that I think about that, even though there is sort of a basic default order. Did you freeze again? No. Okay. Even though there is a default order that you can follow this in, that this becomes sort of like your generator. It's like once you understand yourself and you contemplate how that plays into your relationships, then and you get that sort of integrated, then this whole prosperity sequence starts to become the like generator of your life. And so all of these arrows are double-sided, in that it's becoming sort of this like system that propels itself into further understanding and also like prosperity, which you could say is the outward manifestation of your inner integration, you could say it that way. So here, this sphere here is what was called core in the Venous sequence. And so as you can imagine, or have maybe thought of, that your core wound is often what propels you into a certain line of work. So this is the vocation sphere. It doesn't necessarily mean this is exactly what you're going to be doing for work, but it sort of could be what you're doing for work, your business, what you want to get into in life. And it's not exactly cut and dry in that, like, it'll always tell you like, oh, you're going to be in the service sector or whatever, but it is going to be the energy of what you put your energy into. And it's often driven by your core wound. Like what was so near and dear to you becomes the thing that you then can give to others and support the world in. So this is the vocation sphere. And again, it's a overlapping one. So the line will be the same number, but if you read it in the Pearl sequence, it's going to have a different title than in the Venous sequence. So moving from vocation down the pathway of initiative to the culture sphere. The culture sphere is about your culture. So that's your own personal life culture. So that'll be sort of you know, the types of people that you have around, the types of things you want to get into, the culture, like what you like, what you're drawn to, what's drawn to you, the culture of your engagements with the world. You know, the spice market, like what are the spices at your type of cultural market? Like what are the types of people that you connect with, what's their culture, what does it feel like, what does it look like? So it probably would have been good to have at least my lines so you can get an idea, but you can always go and read all the lines for the culture sphere. So then moving from culture back up to this is your life's work when you're looking at it any other way, also doubles as your brand. And so that you know, branding is hot topic right now in our world. It doesn't necessarily mean that that is like your brand to sell something, although it could be, but you know, it's kind of like in terms of your prosperity sequence and your this pearl sequence, your brand is sort of like how you present, you know, what you are in terms of how you fit into the world's scope and all that entails. So you can see how a lot of these go hand in hand, your vocation and your culture, like what work you do and what's important to you has to do with your culture, how you be and what's important to you, and your brand, how you're presenting, what you're offering to the world is very informed by your culture, and it's informed by your vocational core wound interests. Like, and that's why all of these arrows can be double-sided, because they're all interplaying together to, you know, propel your life forward and to manifest your gifts basically into the outside world. So that's the brand. The pathway from brand to vocation is service. You can read more about these in the book. And then we have at the center of everything, the pearl. So this is the pearl sequence. The pearl is obviously like what a pearl is. It's what's important to you. It's ingrained into who you are as a theme that you'll always come back to. It informs the way that you do everything else. It's just something that is intrinsically important to who you are. And it continues to weave itself throughout the theme of your life because it's the essence of who you are and what's important to you. So, and then obviously these are all quantum, they're double-sided. Whatever your concept of the word quantum is, you can see how the pearl is sort of the nugget of importance to everything else you do. So it affects and is affected by everything else you do. And, you know, the closer you can come to the pearl of what's important to you, the more it serves and feeds everything else exponentially. So yeah, can you still see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, so I have not studied the human design chart. I've been just naturally drawn to the gene keys, and I have looked at my human design and have started to look into it more, but I really don't know very much at all about it. I do know that Richard Rudd, who channeled the gene keys, was a student of the human design. This is, I think this is the case. He was a student of the human design before he channeled the gene keys. And he channeled the gene keys and then helped to integrate the two systems. So as you see in the human design chart here, which is a totally different system, they're not like necessarily.
Oh, hold on.
Okay.
I see you. I don't see your screen.
What the heck is going on? Oh, I never shared screen. Okay, so the human design, as you can see here in all these different centers, have these numbers. And over here, we have these numbers with the points. So these are all gene keys and lines. And all of these numbers in this human design chart are also gene keys. So when he channeled the gene keys, as far as I understand it, was able to integrate the two systems and add the gene keys to the human design. And so that's just food for thought if you become interested. And, you know, it's all a natural progression as to which system speaks to you. And for me, it's been the gene keys. And for some reason, the human design hasn't spoken to me as deeply yet. So for what it's worth, that's basically what I know about it, that these numbers are the gene keys. And as you start to learn more about the human design, you'll find out how it all works together and integrates with the gene keys. So that is that. And yeah, here's a list of the pictures that I use, the links just for good measure. And I think that's it. So that's just sort of, you know, the basic breakdown of how the profile works. And of course, there's infinitely more directions and insights that you can receive by doing your own study. And I know a lot more than that, but also feels like barely anything because there's so much you can go into. But the books are insanely informative, and there's so much information online, whether it's through the Gene Keys website or different videos that Richard Rudd has done and meditations. And one thing that I love that I read in it is that part of the fact that it is a transmission, and just in the same way that words are limited and we're using them anyway, there is so much that's written in between these words energetically. And so even just like sitting with the book or reading one page one day, or even sitting with your profile, is going to start to impart you know, the insights through you. And because my own journey has made it so that, like, at the beginning it was too much for my constitution to handle, being that I tend in a very intellectual direction myself, that it triggered me. Basically, it activated my mind to go off in all of these ways where I was like intent on figuring it out, and I wanted to know how it was going to fix all my problems, and I needed to understand it deeper, and that inevitably limited my ability to be with it because I would just get tapped out, like shut down. And it was over many years of just having it in my sphere and then slowly talking about it with other people, or just sitting with it in different ways, and then my own process of becoming more embodied and making sure that I was balancing the mental sphere with other things that allowed me to start to open up to it in a way where now I can let it soak in and let the contemplation go at its own pace and not try to force it or need to or let it overwhelm me, because really it in intelligence of any kind, or these tools, like, they're meant to work for us and they're not meant to confine us. And so I say that to just mean that it will work with you and the time and scope that it needs to and you want it to. It doesn't have to look any certain way. You don't have to study it in any certain order if you don't want to. You don't have to do it all right now. It's sat with me for almost 10 plus years at this point. So it's an amazing transmission that will speak through your life if you are graced with the ability to let it take its time and your time, and it will change how you see it, will change over time too. And I just like to remind us all that we don't need to force it. So that's basically it. Feel free to ask any questions you have, and then that will be it for now.
I just want to say that, in the short amount of time I've been studying it with you, which is just only scratched the surface, that the biggest amazement I take away so far is just that it is really a living, breathing oracle. It is alive, and it's changing and morphing as you study it. So you can zero in on one part of it, but you can go back to the same thing that you were focusing on, and it'll be totally different. So yeah. I'm completely convinced that it just is moving and alive, and I can't wait for more of that. It's really a magical quantum morphing of intelligence from somewhere.
Yes. Yeah, and it's like I said, it's meant to work with you. So if you know that, and you can have a sort of looseness, which I associate with that word contemplation. The word contemplation is sort of like letting yourself sit with things and letting them speak to you without needing to draw immediate conclusions. And it's sort of that same thing. Like, if you can allow space for that to be true, that you read it one day and it says something to you, and you read it another day and it tells you something totally different, that like, that doesn't mean that the first thing you read was wrong and this now it's different. It's like you're saying, it's like a living, breathing thing. And as much as we can do that in our relationships with people too, where it's like, yeah, sure, you may seem relatively the same from one day to the next, but I would be doing you a disservice to assume that that meant any certain thing about you, and to not just let you be like a living, breathing, changing display of consciousness and existence. And so yeah, it's beautiful from that perspective.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I appreciate the way that you do really well in giving a clear understanding in parts of it when it's obviously such a very deep thing to connect with. I mean, I don't think there's any end to the depth of what you can pull out of it. And so it's hard really to put words to it a lot. So anybody that can share what they gather from it and project it is amazing.
Yeah, totally. Thank you. And of course, I feel like as it is with life, like maybe in a week I'll learn something new that makes me realize I was narrow-minded about a certain thing. And so, but that's just indicative of the whole process. So it's yeah, it's fun to play with. So well, that's that for now. Stay tuned for more.